There's a particular kind of hell reserved for men who get everything they ever wanted. In the year 232 before Christ, an old man stood before a massive stone pillar in the heart of his empire. His hands trembled as they traced the words carved into the rock, words he had ordered inscribed decades earlier, words that still burned like acid in his throat every time he read them. 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported, many times that number perished. The old man's name was Ashoka. He ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of Bengal, from the Himalayas to the southern plateaus. His word was law. 400,000 soldiers stood ready at his command, 9,000 war elephants, 30,000 cavalry. His treasury overflowed with gold, his palaces gleamed with marble and precious stones. He had won everything, and he would spend every remaining day of his life wishing he hadn't. This is not a story about triumph. It's not about glory or conquest or the building of empires. This is a story about what happens when a man achieves absolute victory and then realizes, too late, that victory was the worst thing that ever happened to him. This is a story about regret so profound it changed the course of human history. This is the story of Ashoka the Great, the emperor who won the world and lost his soul. But to understand how a man can regret winning, we must first understand what winning cost him. And that story begins not with the old man standing before the pillar, but with a young prince who had no idea what he was about to become. The boy who would become Ashoka was born into violence, not the clean violence of storybooks where heroes fight villains and good triumphs over evil, the real violence, the kind that stains everything it touches and never washes off. His father Bindusara ruled the Mauryan Empire with brutal efficiency. His grandfather, Chandragupta, had built that empire through assassination, betrayal, and rivers of blood. The family business was conquest. The family tradition was fratricide. In the royal palace at Pataliputra, Ashoka learned early that princes who wanted to survive needed to be dangerous. His half-brothers were not his playmates. They were his competition, his rivals, his future murderers if he gave them the chance. The court whispered that Ashoka was different from his brothers, colder, more efficient. When he practiced with weapons, he didn't just learn to fight. He learned to kill without hesitation, without remorse, without that fatal pause that gets men buried. They called him Chandashoka, Ashoka the Fierce. He wore the name like armor. When he was 18 years old, his father sent him away from the capital. Officially, it was an honor. Ashoka was appointed governor of Ujjain, one of the empire's most important cities, a position of tremendous power and responsibility. But Ashoka understood what his brothers understood. This was exile. His father feared him, feared his competence, feared his cold efficiency, feared what might happen if this particular son stayed too close to the throne. So Ashoka went to Ujjain. And he governed with an iron fist wrapped in silk. He was efficient, ruthless when necessary, patient when patience served his interests. He built networks of loyal men. He learned the rhythms of power. He waited. In Ujjain, something else happened, something he would not understand the significance of until decades later, until it was far too late. He met Buddhist monks. They were strange, these men in their saffron robes. They talked about suffering and compassion, about letting go of desire, about the endless cycle of violence begetting violence. They spoke of a man called the Buddha who had taught that all life was precious, that killing was wrong, that peace was possible. Ashoka listened to them the way a wolf might listen to sheep discussing vegetarianism, with distant curiosity and no real comprehension. He had been raised in a world where power was the only truth, where the strong ruled and the weak served or died, where kings were judged not by their mercy, but by the size of their empires and the fear they inspired. What use was compassion to an emperor? What use was peace to a man who would have to fight his own brothers for the throne? The monk's words seemed like beautiful fantasies, lovely lies told by men who had never held real power, who had never faced the actual choice between kill or be killed. Ashoka filed their teachings away in some distant corner of his mind and focused on what mattered, building his power base, preparing for the inevitable succession crisis, staying alive. Years passed. His father aged. The court at Pataliputra descended into chaos as princes maneuvered for position, as ministers chose sides, as the empire held its breath waiting for the old emperor to die and the bloodbath to begin. And when Bindusara finally died, when the throne sat empty and waiting, Ashoka made his move. He didn't hesitate, didn't deliberate, didn't waste time on conscience or doubt. He killed his brothers. Not all of them. The number varies depending on which account you believe. Buddhist chronicles claim 99 brothers died. That's probably propaganda, an exaggeration meant to emphasize his pre-Buddhist wickedness. The real number was almost certainly smaller, but not small enough. Ashoka's main rival was his older brother Susima, the crown prince, the man who should have inherited the throne by right of birth. Susima was arrogant and cruel and incompetent. He would have made a terrible emperor. Ashoka told himself this as he had Susima killed. Some accounts say Susima was thrown into a pit of burning coals. Others say he was burned alive in his palace. The method doesn't really matter. What matters is that Ashoka ordered it done, and it was done, and when it was over, Susima was dead, and Ashoka was emperor. For 4 years after seizing the throne, Ashoka consolidated power. He executed potential rivals. He rewarded loyalists. He crushed dissent. He used every tool in the imperial arsenal, spies and assassins, and the raw terror of his military might, to make certain no one would challenge him. He was brilliant at it. Absolutely brilliant. By the time he formally crowned himself emperor in the year 268 before Christ, no one in the empire doubted who held power. No one questioned his authority. No one dared. Ashoka had won the throne. He had won the empire. He had won everything his grandfather and father had built, and more. He was 36 years old, the undisputed master of the known world, and he had achieved it all through violence so efficient it was almost beautiful. And yet there was one problem, one gap in his perfect victory. One independent kingdom that had resisted Mauryan conquest for generations. One proud realm that looked at his empire and refused to kneel. The kingdom was called Kalinga. It sat on the eastern coast, wealthy from maritime trade, fiercely independent, a thorn in the side of Mauryan ambitions. For Ashoka, Kalinga was intolerable. Not just because its independence was an insult to imperial authority. Not just because control of the eastern seaboard meant control of lucrative trade routes, but because conquering Kalinga would prove what Ashoka desperately needed to prove, that he was a worthy emperor, that his seizure of the throne through fratricide was justified, that he was strong enough to finish what his grandfather and father had started, that he deserved to be called great. In the year 261 before Christ, Ashoka began preparations for war. He had no idea he was preparing for the war that would destroy him. Standing in the palace war room, surrounded by generals and maps and reports from spies, Ashoka felt nothing but confidence. His army was the finest in the world. His war elephants were legendary. His soldiers were disciplined and experienced. Kalinga would fall. It was inevitable. The generals outlined the strategy: multiple invasion routes, overwhelming force, siege engines, the systematic destruction of Kalingan resistance. It would take months, perhaps a year, but the outcome was certain. Ashoka approved the plans. He would accompany the army. He would witness his final conquest. He would see Kalinga brought to its knees. He thought he was planning a military campaign. He had no idea he was planning his own execution. The army marched, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of elephants, supply trains that stretched for miles. the greatest military machine the world had ever seen, rolling toward one small independent kingdom that refused to bow. And in that kingdom, knowing what was coming, the people of Kalinga prepared to fight for everything they had. They prepared to die rather than surrender. And they did die, by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. And Ashoka watched every moment of it. The Kalinga War began in the dry season, when the roads were passable and armies could move. Ashoka's forces swept into the kingdom from multiple directions, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm and crush. The Kalingans fought back with a desperation that surprised even Ashoka's most experienced generals. These were not soldiers fighting for a distant king. These were men and women fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence. They knew what Mauryan conquest meant. They had heard the stories from other kingdoms that had fallen. Surrender meant slavery. It meant deportation. It meant watching your culture erased, your language suppressed, your children raised as imperial subjects rather than free people. So they fought. They ambushed Mauryan columns in the forests. They poisoned water supplies. They launched night raids that left hundreds of imperial soldiers dead before dawn. They defended their fortified cities with a ferocity that turned every siege into a bloodbath. And for every Kalingan who died, the Mauryan army retaliated tenfold. This is what war actually is. Not the clean battles of military history where armies meet on open fields and the better side wins. Real war is the systematic brutalization of an entire population. It's burning villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. It's executing prisoners to terrorize the next city into surrendering. It's watching your own soldiers, frustrated by losses and hardship, turn into monsters. Ashoka was there for all of it. He rode with his army. He observed the sieges. He approved the strategies. He watched as his war elephants crushed Kalingan defenders, as his archers fired volleys that blotted out the sun, as his siege engines pounded city walls until they crumbled. He told himself this was necessary, that conquest always involved suffering, that he was building something greater than the individuals who had to die to make it possible. That history would remember him as a great emperor, not count the bodies that paved his road to greatness. He told himself many things during those long months of campaigning. Later, he would realize they were all lies. The siege of the Kalingan capital, the name of which has been lost to history, was the turning point. Not strategically, the outcome was never in doubt. The Mauryan army was too large, too well-equipped, too experienced. But something happened during that siege that broke something fundamental inside Ashoka. The city held out for weeks. Its walls were strong. Its defenders were desperate. Inside those walls were not just soldiers, but tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, children, elderly. They had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Ashoka's engineers built siege towers and battering rams. They dug tunnels under the walls. They launched stones and flaming projectiles over the fortifications. Day after day, the bombardment continued. Day after day, the defenders held. Until they didn't. When a city falls after a long siege, what follows is not battle, it's massacre. This is one of the oldest truths of warfare, rarely spoken but universally understood. Soldiers who have watched their comrades die, who have spent weeks or months in the mud and blood, who have been shot at and starved and terrified, do not enter a conquered city in a mood for mercy. They enter in a mood for revenge. Ashoka watched his army pour through the breached gates. He heard the screams. He saw the smoke rising from burning buildings. He walked through the streets afterward, when the killing had subsided and the looting had begun. The bodies were everywhere. Not just soldiers, civilians, old men, women, children. In one narrow alley, he saw a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, lying face down in the dirt, an arrow in her back, her small hand still clutching a rag doll. Ashoka stared at that girl for a long time. He tried to tell himself that this was war, that civilian casualties were inevitable, that he hadn't personally killed her, that he couldn't control what happened in the chaos of a city's fall. But he kept thinking about the chain of decisions that led to this moment, his decision to invade, his decision to lay siege rather than negotiate, his decision to press the attack, even as the casualties mounted. Every link in that chain led directly to that little girl lying dead in the dirt. And she was just one among thousands, tens of thousands. The capital fell. Other Kalingan cities, seeing what had happened, either surrendered immediately or were quickly overrun. Within a year, the kingdom was conquered. Ashoka's generals congratulated him. His ministers praised his decisive leadership. He had won. The empire was whole. The eastern seaboard was under imperial control. The Mauryan realm now stretched farther than ever before, an achievement that would secure Ashoka's place in history. He returned to Pataliputra in triumph. There were victory celebrations, banquets, honors bestowed. His soldiers paraded through the streets. The people cheered for their victorious emperor. And Ashoka felt nothing but a vast, empty hollowness spreading through his chest like poison. At night, he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the siege, the bodies, that little girl with her rag doll. During the day, he went through the motions of governance. He attended meetings. He issued decrees. He accepted congratulations. But it was as if he was watching himself from a distance, a ghost haunting his own life. His ministers noticed the change but said nothing. Emperors were allowed their moods. It would pass. But it didn't pass. Weeks became months, and the hollowness only grew. Ashoka found himself thinking about the Buddhist monks he had met decades earlier in Ujjain. Their strange talk about suffering and compassion. Their insistence that violence only creates more violence, that hatred breeds hatred, that the cycle never ends unless someone chooses to end it. He had dismissed them as naive fools. Now their words echoed in his mind like a prophecy. He had achieved everything. He ruled the largest empire in the known world. He was wealthy beyond measure. He was powerful beyond challenge. He was, by every objective standard, one of the most successful human beings who had ever lived. And he was utterly, completely, devastatingly miserable. Because he had finally understood something that all his intelligence and all his strategic brilliance had somehow failed to grasp. That getting what you want doesn't matter if what you want requires you to become someone you can't live with being. He had won the throne by killing his brothers. He had won the empire by conquering Kalinga. He had won everything. And in winning, he had lost himself. One morning, approximately 2 years after the conquest of Kalinga, Ashoka summoned his chief minister to the palace. The minister arrived expecting routine business, perhaps a new military campaign, perhaps administrative reforms. Instead, Ashoka said 5 words that would change the course of Asian history. "I am finished with war." The minister stared at him, not comprehending. Finished with war? What did that even mean? War wasn't something you finished with. War was the foundation of empire. War was how states expanded, how threats were eliminated, how power was maintained. Ashoka repeated himself, slower this time, as if speaking to a child. "I am finished with war. There will be no more conquests, no more campaigns, no more expansion. The empire is large enough." The minister's face went pale. He tried to argue. He pointed out that there were still independent kingdoms on the borders, still threats to imperial security, still opportunities for expansion that would make the empire richer and more powerful. Ashoka listened patiently. Then he said something that made the minister realize this was not a temporary mood or a passing depression. 100,000 people died in Kalinga. 150,000 were deported. Many times that number perished from disease and starvation and the indirect effects of war. I ordered their deaths. I am responsible for their suffering, and I will not do it again. Not ever. Not for any reason. The minister left that meeting deeply troubled. He reported the conversation to other senior officials. They held emergency discussions. Was the emperor losing his mind? Was this some kind of breakdown? How could an empire built on conquest suddenly renounce conquest? What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, because they had not stood in those blood-soaked streets in Kalinga, was that Ashoka wasn't giving up power. He was trying to figure out how to live with what he had done. In the months that followed, Ashoka began a slow, painful transformation. He started meeting regularly with Buddhist monks. He studied their teachings. He practiced meditation. He tried to understand how a man could atone for unforgivable acts. The monks told him something that would become the foundation of his new philosophy. They told him that the past cannot be undone, that the dead cannot be brought back, that no amount of guilt or self-punishment can change what has already happened. But they also told him that every moment is a choice, that the man who committed atrocities yesterday does not have to commit atrocities today. That transformation is always possible, even for the worst among us. Ashoka clung to this idea like a drowning man clings to driftwood. If he could not undo Kalinga, perhaps he could ensure nothing like Kalinga ever happened again. If he could not bring back the dead, perhaps he could protect the living. If he could not erase his crimes, perhaps he could spend the rest of his life trying to balance the scales. It wasn't redemption. He understood that. You don't get redeemed from killing 100,000 people. You don't get forgiven for that. You don't get to feel okay about it. But maybe, just maybe, you could do something useful with the time you had left. Around 3 years after Kalinga, Ashoka formally took refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. He became a Buddhist, not secretly, not privately, but publicly and officially. His court was shocked. Buddhism was a relatively minor religious movement, nowhere near as powerful or prestigious as traditional Brahminical Hinduism. For an emperor to embrace it was bizarre, almost embarrassing. But Ashoka didn't care about prestige anymore. He cared about finding some way to live with himself. And he didn't just become a Buddhist in name. He didn't just perform the rituals and call it done. He fundamentally restructured how he thought about power, about governance, about what an emperor was supposed to do. He developed a concept he called Dhamma. The word is related to Dharma, but Ashoka used it in a specific way. It wasn't exactly Buddhism, though it was inspired by Buddhist ethics. It was a universal moral code, a set of principles that anyone, regardless of their religious beliefs, could follow. The principles were simple: non-violence toward all living beings, respect for parents and teachers, generosity toward the unfortunate, truthfulness and moral discipline, religious tolerance. Nothing revolutionary in the abstract. Many religions taught similar values. What was revolutionary was that Ashoka decided to build his empire on these principles. He created a new class of officials called Dhamma Mahamatras, officers of Dhamma. Their job was not to collect taxes or command soldiers. Their job was to promote moral behavior throughout the empire. They mediated disputes between neighbors. They investigated reports of prisoners being mistreated. They monitored other officials for corruption. They organized relief for disaster victims. They served as living examples of how power could be used for good rather than harm. Ashoka also ordered massive social welfare programs. Hospitals were built in major cities, free for anyone who needed treatment. Veterinary clinics were established to care for sick animals. Trees were planted along roads to provide shade for travelers. Wells were dug in arid regions. Rest houses were constructed where travelers could find food and shelter. These were not symbolic gestures. These were massive infrastructure projects employing thousands of workers, coordinated by imperial bureaucracy, funded by the state treasury. Ashoka reformed the legal system. He didn't abolish capital punishment, but he instituted a mandatory 3-day waiting period before executions, during which cases could be reviewed. He restricted the use of torture. He instructed officials to treat prisoners humanely. He issued regulations protecting animals. Certain species could no longer be killed. Hunting was restricted. On Buddhist holy days, the slaughter of animals was forbidden throughout the empire. These policies were controversial. They interfered with religious practices, disrupted economic activities, and seemed bizarre to people who viewed animals as resources. But Ashoka insisted, and because he was emperor, his will became law. And then he did something unprecedented, something that would ensure his transformation wasn't just remembered as court gossip, but would echo across millennia. He started writing it all down. On massive stone pillars erected throughout his empire, on rock faces carved with inscriptions, in multiple languages so everyone could read them. He didn't write propaganda. He didn't boast about his conquests. He didn't claim divine favor. He wrote the truth. 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported. Many times that number perished. He wrote about his remorse, his guilt, his determination never to repeat his mistakes. He wrote moral instructions, urging his subjects to live ethically, encouraging religious tolerance, promoting non-violence. He wrote as if he was speaking directly to the people, explaining his transformation, admitting his failures, asking them to be better than he had been. These inscriptions still exist. 22 centuries later, you can visit them. You can read his words. You can hear the voice of a man trying desperately to atone for the unforgivable. But here is what haunts me about Ashoka's story. Here is what keeps me awake at night thinking about it. He did all this. He transformed himself. He restructured his empire. He promoted peace and compassion and moral governance. He built hospitals and planted trees and protected animals. And it wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Because those 100,000 people were still dead. Those families were still shattered. That little girl with her rag doll was still lying in that alley, and no amount of good deeds could bring her back. There's a question I want you to consider, a question that sits at the heart of Ashoka's story and perhaps at the heart of all human morality. If you do something unforgivable and then spend the rest of your life trying to make amends, does that change what you did? Does it matter? Does being sorry count for anything when the damage is permanent and the dead stay dead? Ashoka grappled with this question every single day for the last 30 years of his life. He would wake up in his palace, surrounded by luxury and power, and the first thought in his mind was Kalinga. He would attend to imperial business, meet with officials, issue decrees, and beneath every word was the weight of those 100,000 dead. He built hospitals, and he knew that every person those hospitals saved was still just one person, and he had killed 100,000. He promoted non-violence, and he knew he was the most violent man in living memory. He preached compassion, and he knew his compassion came too late for everyone who mattered. This is what his ministers and generals didn't understand. They thought he had become weak. They thought he had lost his edge, his ruthlessness, his understanding of how power actually works. They were wrong. Ashoka understood power better than ever. He understood it so well it made him sick. He understood that power is violence, that empires are built on corpses, that every comfortable palace and prosperous city and secure border is maintained by the threat of overwhelming force against anyone who challenges it. He understood that his empire, his transformed, compassionate empire, with its hospitals and rest houses and moral officers, was still fundamentally held together by the same thing that held his grandfather's empire together: fear. The provincial governors accepted his edicts about non-violence and compassion because they feared what would happen if they didn't. The border tribes stopped raiding because they feared Mauryan retaliation. The merchants and farmers paid their taxes because they feared imperial punishment. Ashoka had not abolished fear. He had simply become more sophisticated about wielding it. And this knowledge tortured him, because he wanted to believe his transformation was real. He wanted to believe he had fundamentally changed, that the empire he governed was different from the empire his grandfather built, that power could be exercised ethically. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he wondered if he was just lying to himself, if his entire transformation was just a more elaborate form of tyranny, if his guilt was just another kind of selfishness, making himself feel better while changing nothing fundamental about how empires actually function. His officials certainly thought so. In the Imperial Council, the old guard pushed back constantly against his reforms. They were subtle about it. You don't directly contradict an emperor who still commands the largest army in the world. But they dragged their feet on implementing his welfare programs. They found reasons why the Dhamma Mahamatras shouldn't have too much authority. They quietly maintained military readiness while Ashoka preached peace. And Ashoka let them, because he knew they were right. In Rock Edict 13, after describing the horrors of Kalinga and his remorse, Ashoka included a paragraph that his admirers often ignore. A paragraph that reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of his transformation. He wrote a message to the forest peoples on the empire's borders. He told them he wanted peace. He told them he would forgive those who could be forgiven. He encouraged them to trust him, to practice Dhamma, to live peacefully. And then he added this, "But I want them to know that I have the power to punish, despite my remorse, and I want them to refrain from acts deserving punishment, so that they may escape suffering." Read that again. Really read it. I have the power to punish. Acts deserving punishment. Escape suffering. This is not a pacifist speaking. This is a man who has renounced aggressive war, but absolutely retained the capacity for defensive violence. A man who preaches compassion, but maintains the most powerful military in the world. A man who has transformed himself, but not the fundamental nature of imperial power. Was Ashoka a hypocrite? Was his transformation fake? No, I don't think so. I think he was something more complicated and more human than that. He was a man trying to live with an impossible contradiction, trying to be good while maintaining the power that required him to threaten harm, trying to promote peace while governing an empire built on conquest, trying to atone for the unforgivable while still wielding the sword that committed unforgivable acts. He was, in other words, exactly what all of us are when we try to be better than we've been, imperfect, inconsistent, haunted by our failures, trying anyway. But here's where Ashoka's story gets even more painful. Because personal transformation, difficult as it is, pales in comparison to institutional transformation. And Ashoka learned this the hard way. He could change himself, he could order reforms, he could build hospitals and carve edicts and promote moral governance. But he couldn't change the fundamental nature of the system he governed, and when he died, that system would revert to its true nature with terrifying speed. Ashoka knew this. In his later years, you can see it in his edicts, an increasing desperation, an increasing urgency. In Pillar Edict 4, he wrote directly to his sons and grandsons and descendants, begging them not to return to the old ways, not to seek military glory, not to think that conquest was worthwhile. They should only consider conquest by Dhamma to be a true conquest, he wrote, for this is of value in both this world and the next. He was pleading, across time, across death, trying to ensure his transformation would outlast him. It didn't work. As Ashoka aged, as his health declined, as his personal authority weakened, the empire began to fracture. Provincial governors grew more autonomous, border regions became restless. The court descended into factional struggles over succession. Ashoka tried to manage it. He appointed Dhamma Mahamatras to monitor officials. He issued increasingly detailed instructions. He insisted on being informed of state business at all hours, whether he was eating or sleeping or in the palace gardens. But he was one old man, trying to hold together an empire through force of will and moral authority, and it wasn't enough. His family life was complicated and troubled. He had multiple wives and consorts, multiple sons and grandsons. The succession was unclear. And an unclear succession in a system built on fratricide and power struggles meant disaster. There are suggestions in the historical sources that his increasing devotion to Buddhism created tensions with his family and his officials, that he was spending too much on religious donations, that his welfare programs were draining the treasury, that his emphasis on non-violence was making the empire weak. Some sources claim that in his final years, Ashoka became so obsessed with giving to the Buddhist Sangha that his ministers had to intervene to prevent him from bankrupting the state. Whether or not these specific stories are true, they point to a real problem. Ashoka's idealism, admirable as it was, had practical costs. Hospitals and rest houses and tree planting programs require money. That money comes from taxes. Those taxes create resentment. That resentment creates political instability. And underlying everything was the fundamental question his officials kept asking: how do you maintain an empire when you've renounced the methods that maintain empires? Ashoka's answer was that you govern through moral authority, through earning loyalty rather than demanding it, through serving your people rather than exploiting them. It was a beautiful answer, and for 30 years, through his personal force of will, he made it work. But personal force of will dies with the person. In the year 232 before Christ, Ashoka died. He was probably in his early 70s, an advanced age for his time. The exact circumstances are unknown. No dramatic deathbed scene. No final words preserved for posterity. He simply died, as all emperors do, as all humans do. And with his death, the experiment ended. What happened next is instructive. Within 4 years, the Mauryan Empire had split into eastern and western halves, each with its own ruler. Within 50 years, the empire had fragmented into competing kingdoms. Within a century, the Mauryan dynasty was extinct, overthrown in a military coup. The Dhamma Mahamatras disappeared, the social welfare programs collapsed, the hospitals were not maintained, the edicts were forgotten. And the new rulers? They went right back to the old methods: military expansion, ruthless suppression of dissent, the standard imperial playbook that Ashoka had spent 30 years trying to transcend. It was as if his transformation had never happened. Except it had happened, and the evidence was carved in stone. For over 2,000 years, Ashoka's pillars stood, weathered by time. Many were lost or destroyed, many more were buried or forgotten. The Brahmi script they were written in fell out of use, making them unreadable. But they remained, silent witnesses to one man's desperate attempt to atone for the unforgivable. And here's what haunts me most about Ashoka's story. He knew this would happen. In his edicts, you can feel his awareness that his transformation was fragile, that it depended on him personally, that it might not survive him. And he did it anyway. He built the hospitals knowing they might not last. He carved the edicts knowing they might be forgotten. He promoted Dhamma knowing his successors might abandon it. He did it anyway. Why? Because what else could he do? The dead were dead. Kalinga was conquered. His brothers were murdered. The past was fixed and unchangeable. But the present was still happening. People were still suffering. And as long as he had power, as long as he had resources, as long as he was still breathing, he could choose to use that power to reduce suffering rather than cause it. It wouldn't redeem him. It wouldn't change what he'd done. It wouldn't bring back that little girl with her rag doll. But it might help someone. It might ease someone's pain. It might make the world infinitesimally less terrible than it would have been otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, someone in the future would read his words carved in stone and understand what he was trying to say. That transformation is possible, that regret can be real, that even the worst among us can choose to be better. Not perfect, not redeemed, not forgiven. Just better. In his final years, There's a story that Ashoka would stand before his pillars, reading the words he had carved decades earlier, reading the casualty figures from Kalinga, reading his confessions of remorse, and he would weep. Old man's tears for crimes committed in youth, useless tears that changed nothing, tears that the dead would never see and wouldn't accept if they could. But he wept anyway. Because what else could he do? He had won everything and lost everything that mattered. He had transformed himself and accomplished nothing. He had spent 30 years trying to atone and knew he would die unforgiven. And still, the sun rose each morning. And still there was work to do. And still he was emperor, with all the power and responsibility that entailed. So he got up. He attended to governance. He promoted Dharma. He built hospitals. He carved more edicts. Not because it would redeem him, but because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was its own kind of crime. For over 2,000 years, Ashoka was forgotten. Let that sink in for a moment. One of the most powerful emperors in human history, a man who ruled territory stretching from Afghanistan to Bengal, a man who built hospitals and carved his words into stone pillars 40 feet tall. A man whose transformation was so profound it changed the course of Asian civilization. Forgotten. His name disappeared from common memory. The Mauryan Empire became legend, then myth, then nothing. India experienced wave after wave of conquest. New dynasties rose and fell, new religions arrived. Islam transformed the religious landscape. The Mughals built their empire, then came the British. And through it all, Ashoka's pillars stood, mute and unreadable. Local populations sometimes venerated them as sacred objects, not knowing who made them or why. The Brahmi script had fallen out of use centuries earlier. The inscriptions might as well have been written in an alien language. The man who had desperately tried to leave a message for the future had been silenced by time itself. Until the year 1837. A British officer named James Prinsep, working with Indian scholars, finally cracked the code. He deciphered Brahmi script. And suddenly, after millennia of silence, Ashoka's voice could be heard again. Imagine being a 19th century scholar, reading these inscriptions for the first time, reading an ancient emperor's public confession, his admission of guilt, his statistics of slaughter, his remorse. 100,000 killed. 150,000 deported. Many times, that number perished. In an age when European colonial powers were justifying their domination through claims of bringing civilization to backwards peoples, here was proof that ancient India had produced sophisticated governance, moral philosophy, and enlightened rulers long before Europeans arrived. The discovery was revolutionary. Indian intellectuals and independence activists seized upon Ashoka as a symbol. Here was an emperor who represented the best of Indian civilization, not through military might, though he had that. Not through wealth, though he possessed it, but through moral transformation, through the courage to admit mistakes, through the decision to govern ethically. Jawaharlal Nehru, who would become India's first Prime Minister, wrote about Ashoka while imprisoned by the British in 1944. He portrayed Ashoka as embodying India's highest ideals: tolerance, non-violence, moral governance. And when India gained independence in 1947, when the new nation needed symbols to represent what it aspired to be, they chose Ashoka. The Ashoka Chakra, the wheel from atop his pillars, was placed at the center of the Indian flag. The lion capital from Sarnath became the official emblem of the government of India. You see it everywhere in modern India. On currency, on passports, on government buildings. Think about what this means. A nation of 1.4 billion people chose as their central symbol the legacy of a man who renounced violence, who publicly confessed his crimes, who spent 30 years trying to atone for the unforgivable. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. Because in death, in being forgotten and rediscovered, Ashoka achieved something he never could have achieved in life. In life, his transformation was fragile. It depended on his personal authority. It couldn't outlast him. His empire collapsed. His reforms were abandoned. His vision died with him. But in death, after being forgotten for 2 millennia, after his inscriptions were finally read again, Ashoka became something more powerful than he ever was. As emperor, he became an idea. The idea that transformation is possible, that even those who commit terrible acts can choose to become better, that power can be used ethically, that admitting mistakes is strength, not weakness. This idea spread far beyond India. As Buddhism carried Ashoka's story across Asia, he became a model of righteous kingship in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, in Tibet, in China, in Japan. Rulers across Asia invoked his name and his example, often while doing things Ashoka himself would have abhorred. But the idea persisted. The standard had been set. Even rulers who failed to meet it knew what the standard was. In the 20th century, as Buddhism gained followers in the West, Ashoka's story reached a global audience. The Dalai Lama cited him as an example of compassionate leadership. Peace activists invoked his transformation. Scholars analyzed his attempt to govern ethically. At Mementos Historians, we preserve these stories precisely because they matter. Not just as historical curiosities, but as mirrors reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, morality, and the human capacity for both cruelty and transformation. And Ashoka's story matters because it refuses to offer easy answers. It would be comforting if his story had a clean moral, if he had transformed, governed perfectly, created a lasting legacy of peace, and died knowing he had redeemed himself. But that's not what happened. He transformed. Yes, but his transformation was incomplete and inconsistent. He governed more ethically, yes, but his empire was still maintained by the threat of violence. He tried to create a lasting legacy, yes, but his empire collapsed within decades of his death. And redemption? He never found it. He died knowing he was unforgiven, knowing that no amount of good deeds could balance the scales, knowing that those 100,000 dead would stay dead forever. So what's the point of his story? If transformation doesn't lead to redemption, if ethical governance doesn't guarantee lasting change, if regret doesn't undo the harm, then what's the point? The point is that he tried anyway. He couldn't bring back the dead, so he protected the living. He couldn't undo Kalinga, so he prevented future Kalingas. He couldn't redeem himself, so he dedicated himself to reducing suffering. Not because it would earn him forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. And that matters. That choice matters. Even if his empire collapsed, even if his reforms were temporary, even if his personal transformation was incomplete. Because every hospital he built helped real people, every well he dug provided real water, every edict he carved planted a seed of an idea that would eventually blossom in ways he never lived to see. His failure as an emperor became his success as a symbol. His inability to permanently transform his empire became an inspiration for others to attempt their own transformations. The man who regretted winning taught the world that winning isn't what matters. What matters is what you do with the time you have, how you treat the power you possess, whether you choose to reduce suffering or cause it. These questions are not ancient history. They're urgently relevant right now, today, in our world. We live in an age of tremendous power, technological power, military power, economic power. The decisions made by leaders today affect billions of people. The systems we build will shape civilization for generations. And like Ashoka, our leaders face choices. Like Ashoka, they must decide whether to use their power ethically or simply to maintain and expand it. Like Ashoka, they must grapple with the fact that past harms cannot be undone, only prevented from happening again. Ashoka's story asks uncomfortable questions of all of us, not just our leaders. If you've done something you regret, something that can't be undone, What do you do? Do you wallow in guilt? Do you pretend it didn't happen? Do you rationalize and make excuses? Or do you do what Ashoka did? Acknowledge the harm, carry the weight, and then, despite knowing you'll never be redeemed, try to be better anyway. If you have power, any power, even small power in your own sphere of life, how do you use it? Do you use it to dominate, to control, to serve your own interests? Or do you try, however imperfectly, to use it in ways that reduce suffering? If you're part of systems that cause harm, systems that can't be easily changed, what do? Do you shrug and say, that's just how things work? Or do you acknowledge the contradiction, carry the discomfort, and try to bend those systems towards something better, knowing you'll probably fail? These are Ashoka's questions. He never answered them perfectly. He struggled with them until his death. But he didn't stop struggling. He didn't give up. He didn't retreat into cynicism or nihilism or comfortable denial. He kept trying, and his trying mattered. 2,300 years after his death, we're still talking about him, still learning from him, still inspired by him, still grappling with the same impossible questions he grappled with. The pillars he erected are protected monuments now. Tourists visit them, scholars study them. The words he carved in desperation and hope still speak. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse. For when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous and weighs heavily on his mind. An emperor speaking across millennia, admitting his crimes, sharing his pain, asking us to learn from his mistakes so we don't repeat them. Did we learn? Have we stopped conquering? Have we ended war? Have we created the world Ashoka dreamed of, where moral governance replaces violence, where compassion guides power? No, of course not. We're still fighting wars, still causing suffering, still struggling with the same contradictions Ashoka struggled with. But some of us are trying. Some leaders attempt ethical governance, some systems incorporate compassion, some individuals choose to reduce suffering rather than cause it. And that's Ashoka's real legacy. Not a perfect solution, not a guaranteed redemption, just the stubborn, impossible, utterly human insistence that we try anyway. There's a particular kind of courage required to keep trying when you know you'll never succeed completely, when you know your efforts are temporary and imperfect. When you know that even your best work will probably be undone by those who come after you. But that's the only courage that matters. The courage to build hospitals that might not last, to carve messages that might be forgotten, to transform yourself knowing transformation doesn't erase what you've done. To do good not because it will save you, but because people need help and you have the power to provide it. That's what Ashoka's life teaches us, not that transformation is easy, or redemption is possible, or good triumphs over evil, but that the choice to try, to keep trying despite inevitable failure, to carry the weight while still moving forward, that choice is available to all of us, every day, every moment. Ashoka the Great died 22 centuries ago. His empire crumbled, his reforms were abandoned, his vision seemed to die with him, but his voice, carved in stone, survived, and it's still asking us the questions that matter. What will you do with your power, however small? What will you do with your regrets, however deep? What will you do with the time you have left, however brief? Will you try to be better, knowing you'll never be perfect? Will you work to reduce suffering, knowing you can't eliminate it? Will you transform yourself, knowing transformation doesn't equal redemption? Or will you give up before you start, declaring the effort pointless because the outcome is uncertain? Ashoka chose to try, despite everything, despite knowing he would fail in many ways, despite knowing he would die unforgiven. He tried anyway. And that's why, 22 centuries later, we're still telling his story, still learning from his struggles, still inspired by his refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been so much easier. The ruthless conqueror who regretted winning became the emperor who taught the world that regret can be a beginning, not an end. That guilt can motivate action, not just paralysis. That even the worst among us can choose, in each remaining moment of our lives, to do something useful with our remaining time. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, not to erase what we've done, but simply because it's the right thing to do, because people are suffering and we have the power to help, because the alternative is to do nothing, and doing nothing is its own kind of crime. Ashoka's pillars stand in India today, protected and preserved. Visitors come from around the world to see them, to read the words of an emperor who won everything and lost everything that mattered, who spent 30 years trying to atone, who died knowing he had failed in many ways, but had tried in every way he could. If you found yourself moved by Ashoka's struggle, if his questions resonated with your own battles, with regret and responsibility, and the impossible task of being better than you've been, then subscribe to this channel. Because these are the stories we tell here, stories of flawed humans trying to be better, stories that refuse easy answers but offer something more valuable, honest confrontation with what it actually means to be human. Hit that like button if you believe, as Ashoka came to believe, that transformation is possible even if redemption isn't, that we can choose to be better even if we can't erase what we've been, that the effort matters even if the outcome is uncertain. And leave a comment telling me what you'll do differently tomorrow. Not some grand gesture, not some perfect transformation, just one small choice to reduce suffering rather than cause it. To use your power, however limited, in ways that help rather than harm. Because that's what Ashoka teaches us. Change doesn't happen through grand visions or perfect plans. It happens through daily choices. Through the stubborn insistence, repeated every morning when you wake up, that today you'll try to be slightly better than you were yesterday. Even if you fail, even if no one notices, even if it doesn't change the world, you'll try anyway. Because 2,300 years ago, an emperor stood in the ruins of his victory and made that same choice. And his choice echoes still, carved in stone, speaking across the centuries to anyone willing to listen. The ruthless conqueror who regretted winning became the teacher we still learn from today. Not because he found all the answers, but because he had the courage to ask the right questions and keep asking them until his final breath. What will you do with your regrets? What will you do with your power? What will you do with the time you have left? Ashoka spent 30 years answering those questions. His answers were imperfect and incomplete, but they were answers. He tried. Now it's your turn.